Herefordshire village of Wrestlingworth is the proposed site of a new solar farm, but many of the people who live there aren't happy. They say it'll only be 100 metres from the high street and will be an eyesore and affect wildlife. And they invited their MP, Alistair Burt, to take a look. We'll talk to Alistair Burt, the MP, later on. But first, let me introduce you to Nicola Adkins, who is one of the residents. Nicola, good afternoon.
Yeah.
Welcome to the programme. How did the visit go today?
Yeah, it was excellent, actually. Alistair came, he was very receptive, he was driven around.
Herefordshire village of Wrestlingworth is the proposed site of a new solar farm, but many of the people who live there aren't happy. They say it'll only be 100 metres from the high street and will be an eyesore and affect wildlife. And they invited their MP, Alistair Burt, to take a look. We'll talk to Alistair Burt, the MP, later on. But first, let me introduce you to Nicola Adkins, who is one of the residents. Nicola, good afternoon.
Yeah.
Welcome to the programme. How did the visit go today?
Yeah, it was excellent, actually. Alistair came, he was very receptive, he was driven around the site and he walked around the site. He listened to all our views and gave us his steer on possibly the best way we can tackle this through the planning authority, because that's where it's really going to matter.
Do you think he helped?
Oh, he helped enormously. He has tremendous insight. There are views at the top level of government, so secretaries of state have come out and said solar farms should not be on agricultural land taking food production away from us, but they should be on brownfield sites and roofs. And obviously we feel that as well. It's just a question of how we steer that through the planning process.
Okay. This solar farm, is it really only going to be 100 metres from the high street?
Yes. Yes, it is. There's a field from the high street. Obviously, we're in a rural setting. We have fields butting the high street in Wrestlingworth. 100 metres, then there's a hedge, and then from then on there's going to be a 220-acre solar farm, which happens to be right outside my house.
Okay, well, I should imagine that's why you're probably quite miffed to this. But what does a solar farm look like?
Well, as the proposal at the moment is for agrovoltaics. I don't know if you understand that term. I haven't
absolutely no idea what it means,
right.
I'll be honest with you.
Basically, it's solar panels which are several metres apart, so you can apparently graze sheep or grow crops. But if you speak to any farmer, they'll tell you that that's just simply not possible. It's a pipe dream, and it's a way of selling the solar farm to the local community. What we think they're going to be is simply just a field. I don't know if you've seen solar farms by the side of motorways, but it looks like almost a massive sort of static, dark navy lake, and that's what it's going to be. Covering
but I should imagine these things look quite high tech. Will it not? If you once they build it, if they do build it, will you just eventually over time get used to it?
Not at all, because the area that they'd be taking is not only agricultural land, which is part of the beauty of our rural area of Bedfordshire, but it's also part of our village's amenity. It's not just the people like me who overlook the site, and there are one or two of us. It's everybody in the village who walks their dogs, rides their horses, just uses it for walking. And we have a nature reserve right in the middle of it, which has just been adopted. It's land owned by the parish council, but we're encouraging wildlife to flourish there,
Nicola,
and they want to surround it with solar panels.
We'll hear from Alistair Burt later on this afternoon, the North East Bedfordshire MP, but we had a report out earlier this week from British scientists saying, look, we need to start tackling the idea of saving the planet again on a massive scale. Wind farms, solar farms, we really need to start adapting our environment to cope with the future changes in our world, and this could be just that first step.
Absolutely, and they are right in principle, and the government has a massive target, which is that we have to create 15% of our energy needs from renewables by 2020. That's a massive target, and everyone has to play their part. And people in the village of Wrestlingworth who are against this particular solar park are not against solar power per se. They're against it in this location. They're happy for it to be on roofs. They're happy for it to be on commercial buildings, on brownfield sites, not on grade 2 agricultural land, taking it out of food production.
Nicola, thank you. I'm sure we'll talk again. Nicola Adkins is one of the residents in Wrestlingworth. More on this story before 6. And just to update you on the M25 situation, Leslie Knight is a fundraising executive for the Help Appeal. There's a lot of people stuck in traffic for a couple of hours this evening. It's just one of those nights. It's Friday. It's hot, sticky, and it's been horrendous. M40, M25. Don't even go to the M25. Just horrendous. Now, the Bedfordshire village of Wrestlingworth is the proposed site of a new solar farm, but many of the people who live there aren't happy about the idea. They say it'll only be 100 metres from the high street and will be an eyesore and affect wildlife. Now, earlier I spoke to local resident Nicola Adkins, who believes the proposed solar farm is in the wrong place.
There are views at the top level of government. So secretaries of state have come out and said solar farms should not be on agricultural land, taking food production away from us, but they should be on brownfield sites and roofs. And obviously we feel that as well. It's just a question of how we steer that through the planning process.
So Nicola Adkins, one of the local residents, speaking earlier. The Conservative MP for North East Bedfordshire, Alistair Burt, went to Wrestlingworth earlier today to have a look. He joins me now. Alistair, very good evening to you.
Hello, Roberto.
So what did you see?
I saw a beautiful bit of Bedfordshire countryside. Anyone who knows that area will know how lovely it is. A lot of cultivated fields under crops, and the site of what could be a solar farm. There's no plan in at the moment, but certainly the company who's interested in doing it has made inquiries with Central Beds. But the sort of area that it would cover is firstly huge. It is quite visible. It's an area of really very good agricultural land, used by a lot of walkers and riders as well, and people I think would miss something. It strikes me, like Mrs. Adkins, that although renewables are needed, this is exactly the place I think Elizabeth Truss was talking about in saying this is the wrong place.
So what do you make of the residents' objections? Do they have a real solid case here?
Yeah, I think they do. I mean, remember, many people think that they like renewables, but it's always in the wrong place. And sometimes there are applications to say no to solar farms that may not be quite so valid. It's a question of judgment in each case. And also, we do have in Bedfordshire, both in Beds Borough and in Central Beds, places where there are solar farms. They have been perfectly well accepted by local residents because they've fitted the bill, and they haven't produced objection, and they haven't been as intrusive as this one would threaten to be. So I think that in this particular case, should an application be raised, I think constituents would be highly likely and quite right to say this isn't in the right place. We've been doing well on renewables. We've doubled our use of renewables since 2010, and we've reduced by 15% our carbon emissions since then. And you can use other areas. The government ministers have been clear that we want to see solar farms in other places, on brownfield sites and more on roofs and industrial premises. But we lose our agricultural land at our peril, and I think in this particular instance the villagers are right to be very concerned.
But is a solar farm such a major issue? I know we need to develop things like solar farms, some will argue, so we don't rely so much on fossil fuels. We need to start making some pretty significant changes and accept things that perhaps we wouldn't normally like to accept.
Well, as you rightly say, it's a question of judgment, but the question is, can we do both? I don't think that there should be a conflict between environmental needs, agricultural needs, and renewable energy. If we put those things in conflict, that's not what the country wants. The country needs to make sure it can grow its food, and Bedfordshire does a wonderful job in that. But you can find places, as both Central Beds and Beds Borough have done, you can find places where it's perfectly all right to have a solar farm, where there isn't objection, and planning procedures go through. But where there is great risk of serious objection, where there's loss of agricultural land, then I think it's wiser to try and find places where there won't be such objection. And if there were no instances of solar farms in our area, because everyone objected and the councils always respond, then your argument is fair, because we do have to think about renewables. But because there are examples of good places where they can be put, I think if you're going to lose the sort of scale of arable land that's being threatened here, I think that the developers shouldn't go ahead, and I hope if it does come to a planning application, Central Beds will say this is the wrong place.
Alistair, David Cameron has finally seen good sense again and brought you back into his ministerial team. How are you coping at the Department of Health?
Thank you very much. It's a great job. It will cover the integration of adult social care between the NHS and local authorities, which is a big issue issue for everyone who's listening to your programme. It will mean that we will be putting more priority into mental health issues as well, particularly young people's mental health, because that's a big problem. But I also, should any doctors be listening, I also have responsibility for general practice, which is great for my dad, who has retired after being a GP for many years. My father's been a devoted GP, and I learned a lot about what family doctors provide to the community through him. So I'm looking forward to the job very much. Lots of challenge, but lots of opportunity.
Well, I know you're asked a question in the House this week about whether GPs spend too long looking at the computer screens. Can I ask you, Alice, a very different brief to the Foreign Office? I mean, when you go to the Department of Health, do they give you a big file, say, go home and read this?
They give you more big files than you can possibly imagine. It's a very steep learning curve. You know that wonderful film of George Clooney where he's in the boat and it's going up this sheer wall of